So it's that time, dandelion time. Hello, everyone. I'm going to do a little intro to Dandy, and then Lorna is going to talk about its medicinal attributes. So I'm going to start off with its identifying characteristics, its nutritional value, and how we prepare it as a food herb. So dandelion is definitely going to be a familiar one, I think, for every one of you. It's just so amazing. You can eat any part of the plant, and the leaves are medicinal, the root is medicinal. So this is definitely one of the most common plants all around the globe, extremely successful, and is just thriving on human disturbance. Oh, I just feel like I'm holding the most beautiful bouquet, and it's ironic that so many of us love this plant and that other people are so offended by its bright yellow flowers popping up through their expanse of green that they're willing to spray herbicide all over their lawn and basically pollute their land, their waterway, expose children and animals to the toxicity of herbicide just to kill the most useful plant probably in their surroundings. So if you're taking this class, it's likely that you share my sentiments towards this plant rather than the let's just kill it because it's bright and yellow. Dandelion, even though it is familiar and so ubiquitous, it's actually a little harder to identify than some of our other plants, and that's because there's so many yellow composites that resemble dandelion. In fact, botanists have this cute little insider acronym for the dandelion lookalikes, DYC, or darned yellow composite, because there are so many of them and they can be excruciatingly painfully hard to identify. But I've got this check-by-check list that will help you to properly identify it, no problems. So let's start with its scientific name, Taraxacum officinale. It's in the composite or the aster family, the Asteraceae, and it does have a number of really helpful identifying tricks. So let's start with the growth form. So it's a perennial plant. It forms the basal rosette, so all the leaves grow from the base of the plant. There are no true stem leaves. Now, this sure looks like a stem, doesn't it? The flowering stalk looks like a stem, but it does not have any leaves coming from it, and it doesn't branch. It's just one single stalk. This is actually called a scape and not a stem or a stalk. So it's a leafless flowering stalk. It's a scape. So this scape is hollow, and it exudes a white milk or latex when cut. So that little white milk is coming out right now. So the dandelion flower is actually a flower head. So what that means is this is a composite of hundreds of individual little flowers. We call those florets. So if you remember from the Asteraceae family and the plant family videos, these are all ray florets. Every single one of these is its own flower with its own reproductive parts. So we call this structure a flower head. Now, of course, most people just call it a flower, but it's technically a flower head. If you turn over the dandelion flower head, it has these green little bracts or doodads on the bottom, and these are its filaries. Now, as the dandelion flower head matures, those little filaries bend back or reflex towards the base. Let me pick one that really shows that. Here's a flower bud right here that's showing those green filaries or the bracts bent back on themselves. And then here's You can see this one really has those green filaries or bracts bent back towards the base. Now this scape can be covered in white woolly hairs, like this young one is covered in white woolly hairs, or it can be smooth. It can also be tinged red. So those are some good identifying characteristics with the flower. Now let's take a look at the leaf. Dandelion leaves are extremely variable. Look at how deeply lobed this leaf is, whereas you'll often get leaves that are just a little bit lobed. You can see that this one is not lobed as deeply, so they can be extremely variable even on one plant, but also amongst plants. Now this leaf also, when you break it, it exudes a white latex or white milk that will especially come from the midrib right here. Now this part right here, the midrib, this can be tinged red or green, and it's sort of like a rounded little hump here. That's going to help you differentiate dandelion from some of its lookalikes. So it has kind of a rounded hump on the midrib. Now the leaf can be smooth, or it can have kind of sporadic white woolly hairs. You'll often see these hairs more on the midrib rather than other parts of the plant. This particular plant just does not seem to have very many hairs. They're variable. Now, let's take a look at some other of dandelion's lookalikes. Now, the reason that I'm going into so much detail, as I said, there are a lot of yellow composites that really resemble dandelion, but especially before the plants flower, it can be very hard to differentiate from some of its lookalikes. So sow thistle and wild lettuce are two plants that you might confuse dandelion with when they're in their young, immature stage. Both sow thistle and wild lettuce become erect plants, tall, 2 feet tall, sometimes higher. They have actual stem leaves, so that can, right there, that's going to let you know it's not a dandelion. But when they're young like this, they might superficially resemble dandelion to some of you. Sow thistle and wild lettuce often have little prickles on the leaves that dandelion doesn't have, so that can help you differentiate. But it does have a white latex when you break the leaf. So there is a little bit of a white milk that comes out. But the other big way to tell them apart, the midrib here is somewhat triangular in cross-section, and it has like a little keel right here, rather than the rounded hump that we see in dandelion. So both sow thistle and wild lettuce have sort of a keel right here on the underside of the midrib. Now, what if you confuse them with dandelion? They're both edibles. It's fine. It's not going to make you sick, but they don't have the same medicinal attributes. Now, if you only pick dandelion when it's in flower and you have all those telltale traits of the flower, you're not going to confuse it with sow thistle or wild lettuce. So this is cat's ear, Hypocaris radicata, and cat's ear I don't think looks very similar to dandelion when it's not in flower. The flowering stalk branches. It doesn't have the same hollow scape, the same size, so that's going to really help you tell it apart. Additionally, look at these leaves. They're covered in this white fuzzy hair that you can just super fuzzy. The lobes are rounded rather than irregularly toothed like we see in dandelion. So cat's ears leaves, just to recap, they're fuzzy. They have rounded edges. And this cat's ear, also, like sow thistle and wild lettuce, has edible leaves. So if you eat it, that's fine. It is edible. It's eaten in Greece and a lot of parts of the world. And the young flowering stalks are also edible. And again, just to help differentiate, cat's ear, when it's in flower, it has branching flowering stalks. So that's going to help you tell it from dandelion right away. Now, here's the plant that you're just most likely to confuse it with. This is chicory. So chicory, many of you may be familiar with. It has blue flowers in the midsummer. It has true flowering stems or stalks with leaves that come off the stems, divided branches, flowering branches. So, I mean, it really is a different looking plant. And the leaves, when they're in their basal rosette stage, they do resemble dandelion, I think, very closely. So, looks very much like a dandelion leaf. Now, a lot of times when you'll see chicory growing, it's a perennial, so you'll see in the early spring when you might want to be harvesting dandelion leaves, and chicory grows right with dandelion. They grow side by side, really all throughout the globe. This is a super abundant plant as well. So chicory has, this is the blue flowers, and this is the flowering, this is the fruiting stalk from last year that you'll find growing right outside of the plant. So when you see this, you know you've got a chicory, not a dandelion, right? So these are very obvious. Kind of, you can find these throughout the fall and the winter and the spring. Sometimes they'll fall over, and you'll have them on the ground right next to the plant, but that's one way to tell chicory. Now, chicory leaves differ from dandelions in that they are covered by this white, woolly pubescence or hairiness, especially on the underside of the midrib. So just covered with white woolly hairs on the underside, and also the top of the leaf is quite hairy. So especially on the midrib. So let's look at them side by side. So here's a chicory leaf with that white woolly hair. Here's a dandelion leaf. This one, again, doesn't have so much hair, but they can have just a little bit of hairiness, but not this uniform, dense hairiness. Now, what if you confuse them? Chicory leaf is also edible. The root is also edible. You're not going to make yourself sick, but chicory is not going to have the same medicinal attributes that dandelion has. So we want to just be aware of that. All right, so that was a tour of some of dandelion's lookalikes. There are plenty of plants that are called false dandelion that grow really in many habitats. So you want to look up your dandelion lookalikes in your area to make sure to differentiate them, because that wasn't a complete tour of possible lookalikes with dandelion. But let's just quickly review the identifying characteristics. This is really the best way for me to help you identify it, is to actually just hone in on dandelion's traits rather than going over all the possible lookalikes. So again, the leaves all growing from the base of the plant. The flowering stalk is unbranched. It's hollow, and it can be covered with white woolly hairs, green or red. And remember the green bracts or the filaries that bend back on themselves. Only the ray florets. The leaves can be tinged with red, variously lobed, and toothed, irregularly toothed. In fact, that's where this dandelion gets its name, the French dent de lion, or tooth of the lion. So that's, the tooth of the lion. And so regular teeth, big teeth, little teeth, what have you. I think if you use all of those traits, you're going to be good to go to recognize dandelion. And I just want to take a minute to say here that all of these plants, all those ones that I just featured, they all have that white latex when you cut open their tissues. But there are other plants that are not related to dandelion, that aren't in the aster ACE, that also bear that white latex. So the spurge family, or the Euphorbiaceae, is another one, and also the poppy family, or the Papaveraceae. If you've ever grown a poinsettia around the holidays times and you've accidentally broken a leaf and that white milk has come out, or maybe a succulent that you grow, and like pencil plant, or many of the succulents that are house plants, and you break them open and that white milk comes out, those are spurge family members. That white latex is leaves, typically poisonous from the spurge family and often caustic, can irritate or kind of cause like a small chemical burn on your skin. So the poppy family, again, like opium poppy, has a white latex, very complex, a lot of alkaloids, very medicinal, many poisonous members in both of those families. So when you see white latex, you don't want to assume benign Asteraceae. You just don't necessarily even know what family it is in, because even though it's not the most common, most plants don't have that white latex, we do find it in disparate families. So if you're harvesting dandelion leaves for medicine, and again, the leaves have a different medicine than the root. So the leaves are very diuretic. They're more diuretic than the roots, so they increase urination. The leaves are also more bitter than the roots. So if you're harvesting leaves for medicine, best time to harvest them is really right now when they're in flower, and so you can be sure of the identity. And what I'll do is just come along and just give the plant a little haircut. Those leaves you can then dry on screens or open baskets, or you can prepare a tincture out of them. Because the leaves are so high in minerals, though, I like to use them in teas or vinegars over tinctures. Alcohol-based tinctures, I should say, because you won't get the minerals in the alcohol-based tinctures, but you will in a vinegar or a tea. If you're going to eat the leaves for food, the best leaves to get are in the very early spring when the leaves are first emerging. Now, the plants really vary in bitterness throughout the season, but also between plants. Plants that are grown in the full sun and have really divided leaves and are more flat to the ground tend to be more bitter than plants that are spoiled by the garden or nutrient-rich areas. The leaves that are more erect and less lobed tend to be less bitter. But anyway you go, dandelion leaves are going to be bitter. That's why I mix them with other greens. You can add them chopped to salad and to other milder tasting greens like chickweed or violet, which will kind of temper their bitterness. A lot of people like to saute them with milder tasting greens like kale or collards, or some of your wild greens like creasy greens, a little purple dead nettle in there. A southern delicacy is to take bacon grease and wilt the greens, dandelion greens that way, eat them that way. You could do the same with some herbal infused olive oil instead if you prefer. So a lot of different ways to enjoy the greens. So dandelion greens have more iron, riboflavin, and vitamin E than any of our cultivated greens, such as collards, spinach, or kale. They're also really high in fiber, beta-carotene, and calcium. So you can also eat the flower buds and the flowers of dandelion. So when I'm eating the mature flowers, the flowers can sometimes be covered with insects, actually. So after you go ahead and harvest a bunch, you can just sort of lay them in the shade out on a little blanket or in a basket and let the insects depart. But I pull the florets from the dandelion flower like so. You can sprinkle these little florets on salads or icing. You can add them to butters, goat cheese. You can use them as a garnish. You just want to separate them from that green bitter base of the flower head. And you have a recipe for a dandy violet goat cheese spread. And that's just the nice way to eat them. They just add such a beautiful splash of color and dandy energy to your food. So you can also eat the flower buds. So when they're like this, these little flower buds are pretty tender and nice tasting. You can saute them. You can't eat them raw, but they're nicer tasting if you saute them. You can mix them with your other greens. You can prepare them, just like I said, for your dandelion greens. But a lot of people find that the little flower buds are their favorite part of dandelion to eat. So you can also eat the roots of dandelion. They're really more of I think of them more as a medicinal food rather than kind of a staple food because they are really bitter, or they are bitter no matter how you prepare them. But dandelion roots, basically, when you harvest them in the early spring or the fall, they'll vary between plants. So you'll see this one single taproot, or look at this one. This is sort of an interesting, where it's a taproot and then it was probably damaged and it branches. Or here's one that is sort of like many different taproots growing from the base of the same plant. This one was probably damaged too. You really don't know what you're going to get until you dig up the plant, how woody the root is, or succulent, or small, or big. But the roots exude the white latex as well. And what I like to do is just harvest a lot of dandelion roots together at the same time and then sort of grade them into different piles. The kind of woodier, older roots, as long as they're not rotten or mushy or decayed, those can be washed and chopped up and used for tea or made into other preparations. And the younger, more succulent roots can be used for some of dandelion's other uses. Now, very succulent large roots, sometimes I've had them sliced very thin and roasted fresh, and you can just kind of eat them right out of hand. They're kind of like a bitter baked root chip. The roots you can also chop up and dry, and then you can dry roast them in your oven or in a pan until they turn brown and kind of release a roasted aroma. And you can make a roasted dandy root tea that kind of has a little bit of the same tones as coffee. My daughter actually really loves roasted dandy root tea, especially with a little bit of cream and honey. It's very delicious. Now, when you're digging dandelion roots, the roots in the fall are going to be much higher in a specific constituent, in inulin, versus the spring. So spring dug dandelion roots have 2% inulin, whereas the fall dug dandelion roots can have 40% inulin levels. Now, inulin should not be confused with the human hormone insulin. So inulin is a plant carbohydrate storage compound that acts in the human body as a prebiotic. So you've probably heard of the term of the probiotic, which are beneficial intestinal flora that people ingest as a supplement, in a supplement form, but also all the fermented foods that we eat that are still raw and live, yogurt, kefir, kimchi. They all have a lot of beneficial bacteria that act as probiotics in our intestines. Now, contrast that with prebiotic compounds. These are carbohydrates that are actually fructose molecules that are kind of strung together, like you can picture pearls on a pearl necklace. When we ingest those as food or as tea, our body can't break down those bonds and derive nutrition from those foods. Instead, those prebiotic compounds like inulin feed our intestinal flora. So we're feeding our beasties, and that's why it's called a prebiotic, kind of before life. So prebiotics feed our probiotics, or our beneficial intestinal flora. So that was kind of a long-winded way to explain that dandelion roots, especially fall dug roots, when we make tea from the roots or we eat the roots, we're feeding our beneficial intestinal flora. Now, if you roast the dandelion root, the inulin is converted into other carbohydrates and it doesn't feed our beneficial intestinal flora. So that's not a good way to encourage healthy flora. So that real succulent kind of bulky, younger Dandelion root, you can chop up and mix with other roasted vegetables. You can mix it with burdock root and add an herbal touch to your roasted roots. So you can eat the roots when they're not as chewy or fibrous and also not as bitter. But really, any way you go, they're going to be slightly bitter. So you can grow dandelion in your garden, and in fact, when you grow it, its leaves are more succulent and tasty, and the root will also often be more tender and succulent. So you can plant it in regular garden soil. Just make sure to sow the seeds shallowly, as it does germinate better with light. So just sow the seed shallowly in well-dug, loamy soil, and you'll be able to grow a wonderful crop of your own dandelion greens. There are specialty greens available, special varieties of dandelion available that have less bitter leaves, larger leaves, and they're more succulent. So if you're growing dandelion for the first time, try growing one of those special varieties. So you can see that dandelion just has a wide degree of medicinal, edible uses. Lorna's going to extrapolate more on the medicine, but it is truly a gift to humans, and I'm glad to have its cheery flowers in my landscape.